Welcome back to Watches Tonight. I'm your host, Tim Mosso. It is good to be back. After last week's scavenger hunt for the camera, I have returned with everything I promised. Tonight we were discussing the dearth of technicians' watches in the current marketplace and whether the engineer's watch as a genre is dying, or at least mellowing out. Now, we're also going to talk about my favorite pilot's watches, so we pair the relatively weak genre with the one that is absolutely surging, and a review of the favorites of yours truly, your viewer wrist shots. I know I've been tardy. They're all coming back. I should also mention to you, the people who pay for these pixels, no better place to buy, sell, or trade a watch than thewatchbox.com, with over 2,500 pre-owned and vintage watches available right now, as well as my videos, of course. Now, if you want to reach out directly to me with questions you have about purchasing any of these watches or those you see on my Watchbox Reviews channel, tmosso@thewatchbox.com is the direct question and answer email line for your purchase and pricing questions about all of those watches. On Instagram, I am now up to 3 videos a day, 60-second format. We're going to be adding my YouTube-style videos on the Instagram TV side of things, so you're going to get a double dose. Tim_Mosso, help me hit 50K in 2020. I am sure I will do that with your help. Now, jumping into your wrist shots. Show and tell time for adults. All right, James W. shares an FP Journe Elegant 48, kindly on loan from his buddy Sean. Rob E. sails the waves of the Persian Gulf off Dubai with his Tudor Black Bay 58. I was just in Dubai, the new home of Watchbox, the DIFC, if you're ever in town. Russell K. of the UK and his Ulysse Nardin Tellurium Johann Kepler track the lunar eclipse in exquisite form, the masterpiece of Ludwig Oxlin. And Tyler E. collects his coffee with the 2019 Breitling Navitimer 806 1959 re-edition. You wear it well. An awesome piece, and one which I have recently reviewed. Now, jumping into the chat box, let's see who's joining us right here. I recognize we're going to have a small crew because I have not been faithful. Mr. No Date, you have a wrist shot tonight. Mez944, Matt Foster, Jason Chan joining in. Tim, welcome back. Thoughts on the new 321 Speedmaster and the Moser Streamliner? Why not? The Moser Streamliner first. I like the fact that Moser did something different, coming out of the gate with a chronograph instead of another 3-hand with a date display. Going with something that feels genuinely vintage inflected without feeling like a derivative piece. It's of the 70s, no doubt, but instead of a Genta knockoff, they wound up with something that looks like a combination of the old Omega lobster tail bracelet with the bullhead Seamaster chronograph. So it's very different from everything else. It doesn't feel like a Me Too watch, and with 120 meter water resistance and the Graf caliber inside, it is a very serious proposition as a full-time sports watch. I like the fact that they went with their signature Fume dial and that they kept it very spare with a minimum of printing. I also like the fact that they went with a racing dial seconds track, so very cool. Moser wins my vote of approval for what's likely to be 100 pieces of the Streamliner flyback chronograph for 2020. Now, second question, the 321 Speedmaster. I like it. I've been calling for it for a very long time. I remember prior to Basel World 2017, I first cried out for a caliber 321 re-edition, and then just prior to last year's unveiling of the 321 revival, and I mean like 24 hours prior, I was calling for it again. Once it happened, it wasn't quite what we had in mind. It was a high-end haute de gamme handmade caliber. I said this needs to be in series production. Now, with the 321 Speedmaster, it is in series production, so I like it. Just don't expect it to be new and cool forever. Buy it because you love it, not because you think it's rare and exclusive. All right, I can see MT Bone. Hi, Tim. Hello, Mr. T-Bone. Simon Holt joining in. Simon, I believe you are also in our wrist shot cavalcade. We have Long Mac, JBO Surf from Adelaide, Australia. I'm feeling for everyone down in Australia. Big support from all of us around here. You guys are really in the thick of it right now. Our thoughts are with you. Let us know if we can brighten your day in any way. And then right here, we've got Neo saying, I really like the new Moser. We've got Ryan Tinney saying, Tim, thank you for all you do. You're more than welcome. I get paid for this. So it works out for all of us. And then right here, we've got Chaharology saying the new Moser is amazing. Edward M., I'm not going to answer that question. And Joshua Polanski, a good friend of the house in one of our previous watch collector conversations, the best watch collector conversation to date. And then right here, finally, we've got Blue Shirt Buddha. Moser is fantastic. We've got Beauty of sent Tim from Watchbox. What's the latest in Dubai watches? I'm going to say probably platinum, but only if it matches the color of your Lamborghini. And then right here, we've got NATO Steve. Speaking of racing dials, I'd love a Japan Racing re-edition. That would be awesome. And I would love... Let's see, I was going to say a pony, but I wouldn't want a pony. And then I was going to say a Ferrari, but I'm not a Ferrari guy. 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. So just as you would love a Japan Racing Dial re-edition, I would love a car that I can't fit in my garage. Now, let's jump back to our regularly scheduled program and talk about Derek G. and a question he sent to me. Asking, is the engineer's watch genre dead? And then Rolex 6541, IWC 666AD, and Patek 3417. What are they? They are all first-generation engineers' watches, released during the mid-1950s when the rise of public-private engineering cooperatives, generally for the defense industry, when we saw government money allied with private labs, as well as the arrival of big science government-funded research and development. All of that gave rise to a new generation of highly anti-magnetic watches that were designed principally to operate reliably in the presence of large electromagnetic flux densities. And this was the golden era for such watches, as even Jaeger LeCoultre with the Geophysic of 1958 got into the act with a watch designed to be reliable in the presence of strong polar magnetic fields while out on exhibition, or I should say expedition. Today, factors in the decline of technicians' watches. It's been a fallow period. First, departure. Patek, though a pioneer in the segment, has been absent for decades. And if ever a brand could re-energize the type, it would be Patek Philippe. Second, Rolex, though still represented, has been an inconstant a supporter of the technician's watch, as between 1988 and 2007 we had no Milgauss. And the Milgauss we have now has been pretty much unupdated with the exception of a new dial in 2014 since 2007. So Rolex is there and they're playing, but they're not enthusiastic. It's probably not at the top of the column for refresh alongside the Daytona and the Sub. I would also say tech. Every Omega now includes MRI-resistant technology. With the SI-14 hairspring and the anti-magnetic escapements, just about every watch today is more magnetically resistant than the Milgauss 6541 of 1955, which is to say, if every watch is anti-magnetic, no watch is. Any one of the current Omegas could be worn by an engineer. And finally, fashion. IWC's once focused engineers collection has been turned into a retro fashion statement after decades of pushing the limits. And that's the current IWC Ingenieur, but they used to push the limits with new technology. First, there were the soft iron cages like you had in the Milgauss era, and those continued into the 80s, and that was fine, up to the point where new technology like niobium zirconium hairsprings and the 500,000 ampere per meter, the reference 3508, that was an entire reinvention of the engineer's watch. Finally, able to withstand particle accelerators and MRIs in close proximity, you had more risk of the thing bodily being sucked off your wrist than you did of a magnetized hairspring. All of which to say, it's sad that today's Ingenieur is really just a retro play that doesn't even make any pretense of being a technician's watch with specific applied technologies. Likewise, Omega's Railmaster is a vintage play with no unique technology that you can't find in like a Constellation. We now have Constellation master chronometers, which means you've got all the tech in the Railmaster inside a dress watch. What does that mean for the Railmaster? It means it's basically become an entry-level watch, the same way as the Air King, which is mechanically identical to the Milgauss, is sort of an entry-level Rolex. This technology is no longer sexy, and it's no longer exclusive. There's no longer that one watch in the catalog that's designed for the guy who has to go toe-to-toe with serious high-powered electronics. You can wear any of these watches from Omega's catalog, or some of the entry-level watches from Rolex's catalog, as that has the same movement and the soft iron inner cage of the Milgauss, which hurts the exclusivity argument. The Milgauss, it soldiers on as a styling statement, but it's no longer the obvious play when every Rolex now has a niobium zirconium hairspring like that old 500,000 ampere per meter Ingenieur. So the Milgauss is cool if you're like me and you want something a little bit weird, but it's definitely not the thing a stolid and sober CERN employee would bolt on because he's got no other option. Now, as an extension of the fashion argument, we live in an era in which disproportionate amounts of energy and attention are being devoted to a handful of models, brands, and genres. At the moment, we have technicians' watches eclipsed by pilots' watches, by drivers' watches, and of course, as ever, by divers' watches. And all of these watches are stealing the thunder of a relatively undersung, understated, and underappreciated engineer's collection. So Rolex, they've got the Milgauss, but they've got at least 5 watches that are sexier, and that goes for every single brand offering a technician's watch. But hey, it could be worse for fans of engineering genre watches. They could be dress watch fans, and that's probably scraping the bottom of the bucket today, no matter how exquisite, beautiful, and perfectly proportioned a dress watch we are discussing. Jumping into the box right here. Bump. Richard K. Tim, what is the best horology watchmaking, I think you mean $10,000 can buy? Well, Richard, I think the most impressive high horology I've seen for 10 grand was a Chopard LUC Quattro dual time. This was a watch with a manual wind power reserve of 9 days. It would run for 10 in reality. 4 mainspring barrels, 2 sets of stacked barrels. It had a second time zone. It had a date, Geneva hallmark, and a COSC certified chronometer, and I have seen them available in yellow gold for just under $10,000. I have also seen first generation caliber 196 Chopard LUC micro rotors for sale for well under 10 grand. So I would say LUC Chopard from the early 2000s, late 90s would be your best bet for 10 grand. I don't think you're going to find more refinement or more pedigree. Now, of course, you can get Geneva hallmark watches from the 50s for well under 10 grand, but you can have to deal with watches that are fragile, that have sometimes led difficult lives, and which are quite small in most cases. So if you want a modern ultra haute de gamme watch for 10 grand, Chopard. Now, if you want a sports watch of some kind, I would say your best bet would be to find a ceramic cased Blancpain bathyscaphe reference 5000. The gray ceramic case with the blue bezel and the blue dial is awesome. You can pick those up for under $9,000. That's caliber 1315 that is based on the 13 RO ultra haute de gamme movement that goes in the Le Brassus series for Blancpain. So you're getting an automatic version of a very, very, very high-end, high horology manual wind caliber. So you're getting that 3-day automatic that, for all intents, is about as beautifully finished as anything you will find for under $100,000. Now, speaking of value in complications, as ever, if you want complications, the Zenith Pilot Doublematic is probably your best bet for under 10 grand. I've seen for under 10 grand on a strap, coaxial chronometer, annual calendar, 150 meter anti-magnetic Omega Aquaterrace. That's for under 5,000 I've seen. We might even have one on the site now. So you've got a lot of options. Now, jumping in right here, we've got Edward Ledden of Sweden. We've got Tippy Cafu saying, what do you think of current Breguet? I like current Breguet. The problem right now is marketing for the brand. So if you're buying Breguet, the brand is not going to support you after sales with the kind of strong resale values you would expect of a Patek Philippe or even a Jaeger LeCoultre. Breguet takes it on the chin right now. People are interested in the Type 20s and close to nothing else. The new Marine collection launched real weak, and while something like a 5887 is about as great a Grand Comp style watch as you'll ever find, and the Classique Chronometrie 7727 is probably the most significant horological innovation of the 2010s. All the same, I'm going to say that Breguet is a brand to buy used simply because of the sheer haircut you're going to take, but one of the best brands to buy used because what you're getting is substantial and often quite beautifully made. Now, jumping back to our regularly scheduled program, let's talk a little bit about pilots' watches and my favorite pilots' watches. We've featured my favorite dive watches on this show recently, and I offered a review of the engineers genre just a moment ago. Why have I waited over 3 years of these live broadcasts to talk about pilots' watches? Honestly, it's because I just don't love planes and I don't love flying. Now, I can say that I have flown planes. I have even soloed planes several times, but I never caught the bug. It always felt uncomfortable. It felt like a lot of stress dealing with air traffic control. I imagined it would be like flying in a dream. It wasn't. It was like being stuck in traffic at I guess I was flying at about 7,500 feet. So it wasn't what I imagined, and commercial aviation is even worse. A nightmare of pathogens, screaming babies, and airborne gulag accommodations. I will say this, I've avoided pilots' watches on the show because I have nothing but bad associations. But That said, watches aren't airplanes, and you don't need to live the lifestyle to own a lifestyle watch. I will never run the Rolex 24 at Daytona, but I would gladly wear a Rolex Daytona. So I'm a Milgauss fan, and my engineering credentials are suspect, so let's take a dive into pilots' watches, my favorites, and maybe we can reflect on some of yours in the box. We are starting the ticker. You guys tell me your favorite pilots' watches, and as I roll along, I'll read your responses. So, as a ground-bound collector, here are my favorites. Rolex Turnograph, launched in 1953. This was really Rolex's first series production aviation innovation. There were watches built prior by Rolex for pilots, but with the introduction in a mainstream watch, I'm not counting the Zerograph, guys. In a mainstream Rolex, the Turnograph gave us a rotating bezel. Now, it was thought at the time to be useful for everyone from cooks to pilots to travelers, but the reality is that this was a pioneering Rolex pilot's watch that came out a full model year before the GMT-Master, and it's one of my favorites because the Thunderbird connection is damn cool. Everyone thinks military aerobatic squadrons are neat. I think that's an F-84 Thunder Chief right there. So, 1950s, the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds, which are like the equivalent to the Navy's Blue Angels, they wore the Rolex Turnograph, which is a huge feather in the cap of the Rolex because Rolex military-issue timepieces are few and far between, and whether they were issued, whether the pilots bought them themselves, whether Rolex simply volunteered and provided them for free, I don't know. But the fact that this actually happened and that they wore Rolex Turnographs is damn neat, and it's one of the reasons why I love the good old Turno. I would also say vintage is a logical starting point, because this is a way you can get into a true hardcore vintage 1950s first generation Rolex tool watch for less than the price of a Midwestern house. They're not cheap, but they are very, very, very cool because you have options stretching from 1953 right up to about 2010, 2011. And as you can see, if we can go full screen with that, some of the suggested uses for the Turnograph back in the day were decidedly more domestic than the notion of military aviation. Cooking anyone? Turkey in the oven? You better believe it. Laps at the track? Everything was fair game. Even the open sea, it was the all-purpose. I'm choosing it in its aviation form. That is my first pilot's watch. The Japan edition is an awesome modern target for the determined Rolex collector, as they built two versions of this. One with a white dial, one with a black dial. The Turnograph was written in green on the dial. The seconds hand was lacquered green, and then the date itself was green on white. Again, they made them in yellow, gold, and steel, one with a white dial, one with a black dial, 300 pieces of each, very difficult to find and very rewarding if you do. Now, speaking of the Rolex Thunderbird, there was another Thunderbird. There was another Skywalker. The Vacheron Constantin 6782. Now, this came out in the early 1960s. Some sources cite 1962 and a 10-year production run with total production of all models and variants totaling only a few hundred, low hundreds. We're talking like 1 to 300. It was a very cool watch because this was Vacheron taking a page from Rolex's playbook. 36 millimeters, bidirectional rotating bezel, and yes, Vacheron made a pilot's watch, so this watch earned the nickname Thunderbird after its Rolex predecessor, and it was a 36, the Vacheron Constantin, we'll call it the VCT Bird, featured a Turnograph bezel, automatic winding, and more water resistance than was standard in a Vacheron at the time, meaning it was an all-around sports watch. It featured the JLC-based Vacheron Constantin caliber 1072K. Now here we're talking Vacheron's own rose lathe cut guilloche winding mass, a custom 4 ruby roller bearing system for the winding mass, Geneva hallmark finish. You could see it right there on the winding bridge just below the rotor. This was incredible stuff, and you're getting all of this in a pilot's viable watch. Now, produced from the early 1960s into the 70s, this is a true cult watch. A lot of folks don't know this one ever exists, but if this one takes wing in your imagination, I recommend you not settle, as you could pick these up for a fraction of what people are spending today on vintage Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe sports watches from the same period. These were made into the early 1970s, right up to the debut year of the Royal Oak. You don't have to ask me which I would prefer. I would also say this, porcelain dials exist. So if you want an example of this watch made in dozens, not hundreds of copies, there are Grail levels of watch spec within the Grail family of VC Thunderbirds. All right, Let's see what you guys like. What are you into? We got Jonathan C. waking up early in Singapore to join the stream. We have Locutus de Bourg saying, I love the Glasuta Original Chrono. And then we've got Rich Buttery saying, that Vacheron bird looks nicer than the Rolex birds. And then we've got NS something saying, nice, JLC base caliber with Geneva hallmark. I'm with you, my man, right there. Also, we've got DX Mag saying, Bell & Ross 0196 altimeter. Right here, we've got Edward Ledden saying Universal Genève split seconds chronograph Corelli, Italian vendor. Right here we've got Turkischer Meister saying Type 20 Aeronaval Japan edition. We have Joshua Polanski voting for the old Universal Genève Paul Reuter. We have Britt Head saying Oris Big Crown Pro Pilot, and Dog Bear Global Rolex CHNR 126711. And then right here we've got Rich Buddy saying good luck taking your high horology junk into a jet fighter. Rolex is the king of watchmaking. You know, I knew a lot of pilots in the military who could afford nice things and they took them flying. Your watch in the air realistically is a backup instrument, or it's for bragging rights in the ready room. And then right here we've got bunch of copy pasta, and Thomas Burnett saying Breguet Type 20 only watch. Good answer. And then right here we've got Aniket Parkar saying GMT with minutes rotating bezel. Any suggestions for small wrists? You want a GMT with a rotating bezel, but you want you want minutes on the bezel as opposed to 24 hours? Not the most common thing, but I would say realistically, and there are a couple of Omega diving GMTs from the 90s that probably meet that definition. And then we've got Edward Ledden saying Omega Speedmaster X33 Generation 2. That is the one that has the crown that looks like a honeycomb, and then and has the satin finished bezel. And then right here we've got B. Mott saying IWC 3777 Le Petit Prince. That is the IWC Pilot's Watch chronograph. All good stuff, guys. And then we have Zinn Master asking Zinn 356 acrylic versus sapphire. I guess it depends. How rough are you on your watch? And do you own a rubber eraser to smooth out the thermoplastic when you inevitably scratch it? Richard Combs of South Florida saying Patek 5524G white gold pilot's watch. The Calatrava pilot travel time. Stay tuned. You will be a happy man. And Randy Allen, Hanhart pilot chronograph or Breguet Type 20. Simon Holt, Zinn U2 SDR is my daily. I have other obvious Rolex, etc., but Zinns and Damascos are a bit more off the radar. I owe a wrist shot with my boxer dogs. All right, guys, keep those wrist shots coming to Monday Mailbag at thewatchbox.com. And then we have Avi B asking, Tim, recommendations on annual or perpetual from a Longa Unzona. I would say go with the perpetual. Longamatic perpetual, black dial, white metal, be done with it right there. No second thoughts on that. And then, Taylor James saying, I feel like I haven't seen a Black Bay 58 on this show before. It's been there, but as with the Black Bay 58 in the real world, it's a little bit scarce at the moment. But make no mistake, we love the Black Bay 58. Okay, speaking of big things, we talked about a 36mm Vacheron. Now we're talking about a Zenith with a bigger movement than the entire Vacheron watch you just saw. Of course, we speak of the Zenith Pilot Type 20 Montre d'Aéronef, the 5011K, the watch that came out in 2012 and immediately cast a shadow over all of Baselworld because at 57.5 millimeters in diameter, it was literally big enough to eclipse the sun. This is a timepiece that is heavily drawn from several threads of Zenith history. So the inspiration for the watch was drawn from that history, in part thanks to the graphical layout, the fonts, and the hand arrangements of cockpit clocks made by Zenith. Some of these were actually montre d'Aéronef. They were flight instruments. They were the clock for your aircraft. And at the end of the day, Zenith took what was originally a early 60s chronometer caliber designed for clocks, and they put it in a pilot's watch designed to look like many of those clocks. Caliber 5011K in that 250-piece titanium 2012 series was one of the most accurate chronometer calibers ever made. The one in the modern Zenith watch is COSC certified, and it was built in its day 4 chronometers, specifically for high-grade aviation instruments, marine chronometers, and some pocket watches that were themselves suitable for use as marine chronometers. The movement alone had a diameter of 50 millimeters, meaning just the movement in that watch is bigger than an IWC Big Pilot's watch at 46 millimeters, keeping our aviation theme straight. That is absolutely insane. And the idea that they made precious metal versions of this watch that you wear on your wrist is so off the charts. I love the fact that they did it. It's bonkers. It's bonkers the way the Star Wars section of Disneyland is bonkers. Now, this is not the 48 millimeter pilot's watch you know. That's the day in, day out Zenith. Hey guys, if you want to be super cool, if you have some water, even if it's the dog's water, I'd really appreciate that right now. But we do have a dog and we do have dog water, so I'm sure I'll be accordingly served. The watch was built in 250 pieces in titanium, 75 pieces in rose gold, and several micro editions, one of which will feature later in the show. Now, several extraordinary versions of this Type 20 were actually made, and if we can go full screen with that for one more second. Oh, Andrew with the save, how about that? Speaking of saves, there will be no salvation for the Astros. As a Yankee fan, I'm celebrating that right now. That's justice done for 2017 and 2019. I'm sorry, I got a victory lap in me with that water. Thanks so much, guys. I like how you dressed up the dog water in this bottle. Makes me feel special. Kenny, I love you for donating your... Kenny is our house dog. Several extraordinary versions right there. Anyway, you can see the image of the story of flight engraved on the back of a 5-piece tribute to Louis Blériot Zenith 5011K Type 20. What's cool right there is you can actually see Blériot in his cockpit down in the lower right approaching the cliffs of Dovers, and in the upper left you can see the monoplane that he built for the flight. And of course he had a Zenith timepiece on board. Now that 5011K is a special one, but there are several special series, some of which have sapphire cases, some of which have fully engraved cases, and if you were to look at the other side of this watch, it actually has a meteorite dial. Now, I've shown you some of mine. Let me see some of yours. Viewer wrist shots. Cody N. of Cedar Rapids. Let's talk a little bit about what you brought to the table, because my man from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, is wearing his Girard-Perregaux-powered Ebel Type E to the game. Cameron T. continues our seafaring mini theme with his Bell & Ross bronze skull. Abdul R. shares his 1960s Certina helmet from the Black Forest in Germany. I like a little change of pace from some of Abdul's usual modern pieces. He usually throws in one vintage watch, and this one caught my eye. I love that C case design. And Simon H. in our chat box tonight boards his plane for the first flight of 2020 with the JLC Reverso that he bought from Watchbox. Thank you, sir, for trusting our company. Send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com. And I should also mention Richard Combs. I know you're in the box tonight. A watch that you love, I love, and frankly, in 2015, a lot of people hated. The Patek Philippe 5524G. This was a really controversial watch. First of all, there were the pilot's watch purists who hated it because they said, oh, it looks like a Zenith, it looks like an IWC, it looks like a Longines. And then there were the Patek purists who said, this is irrelevant to Patek Philippe. They've never made a watch like this. They never had a 30s, 40s, or 50s aviator's watch that looked like that. Well, Patek said, we have something in the museum that kind of sort of looks like it. Doesn't matter. A beautiful watch is a beautiful watch. And what Patek succeeded in doing was upsetting almost everyone with a watch that I call the boldest of 2015. Why? Because their only goal was to make the world's best finished pilot's watch, and they achieved that goal. The dial of this watch is to die for. We can go full screen with that, if possible. You can see that the dial is granular and like sandpaper. It has an exceptional reflective quality. The hands are extraordinary cathedral form and blued. Note the blued counterweight to the skeletonized counterweight of the Lancet style seconds. Note how you can view the white gold numerals rising up off the dial, because although they look printed, they are in fact appliqué. And what at first glance appears to be the seconds track is actually the date. Plus, we got 2 screw-down crowns for activating the travel time complication. And I'll be frank, 42 millimeters in rose gold or white gold, I'd go for white. There is a 37 millimeter version known as the 7234, but the coolest version of that, 400 pieces, came out just this past year in 2019. If we can go and take a look at the stainless version of the Patek Philippe Calatrava Pilot, even though that was called the Calatrava Pilot Ladies, 37 millimeters stainless steel, that sounds fine from my wrist. That would be my choice of the lot. But the richness, the opulence, the excess of the 5524G, it still draws me in, and it remains my favorite new watch of 2015 simply because it was so subversive in its day. All right, postscript to this story, my favorite new watch of 2019, other than the Genta 50th anniversary tribute, was the Patek Philippe 5520P. Why? Because it was an ultra-luxury alarm watch. Alarm watches are generally regarded as entry-level complications, a sort of Volks complication, if you will. This took a 24-hour format alarm and a travel time function, put them together with supernova lume, and created what might be the world's best $226,000 travel watch. Patek, I'll drink to that. Now, speaking of your choices, let's see if we have any more suggestions. We got Chris Davis saying, I love the 5524G. Fan right there. We got Thomas Burnett saying, I quite like Bell & Ross, but he loves that Reverso. We got Christopher Peterson asking, Tim, what do you think? Blancpain Barracuda versus Rolex Submariner. Well, right now there's only one Blancpain Barracuda, the recent special series, whereas there are many Rolex Submariner options. And could I find a sub that I like more than the Barracuda? Absolutely. So if we're going to compare like to like, a steel sub to the Barracuda, I would be a fan of something along the lines of a rarity like the 168000 for collector's sake, or I would say I'm a really big fan of the old 5512 in chronometer spec. The first Crown Guard Rolex sub and far less common than the 5513. Modern, I would say I'm probably a fan of the Hulk because I love the color green. I think the sub gives you more to think about, whereas if you want the Barracuda, you want the watch that came out last year. And then right here, let's see who we've got in the box. We've got Mark S. saying, not Tim, but the Barracuda looks sick, but has dress watch movement. That's true. The 1150 is not as tough as the 1315, whereas most Rolex movements, even dating back to the 50s, have been traditionally fairly tough. And any Rolex sub made since the 60s is going to be double tough. The modern ones are almost indestructible, so you got to consider that if you can use the watch rough. But then again, I've never seen someone break an 1150, and you'd have to do something pretty silly to make one of those things malfunction. Mainly, you'd have to really shock it or drop it. And just about anything dropped is going to suffer. Bump David S. saying, I'm going Blancpain 50 Fathoms all day. And then we've got MBD re-upping my choice, Moser Heritage Bucherer Blue. Okay. Boom. Now, let's talk a little bit about pilot's watches. This is an unconventional BR because most folks think of the BR revival genre. They think of the IWC Big Pilot's watch that came out in 2002 and is still with us. But the Glasuta Original Senator Navigator B-Dial, can we go full screen with that? I thank Bernard Watch for the photo I stole from them. But that right there is my favorite BR revival watch. It came out in 2006 at Basel World, and at 44 millimeters by only 12.8 millimeters thick, that is a much more wearable watch than the IWC Giant. Well, you might ask, why didn't I pick the Big Pilot's watch? And there's a very simple reason I didn't pick the Big Pilot. It is unwearable. At 56 millimeters lug to lug, 46 millimeters in diameter, and about 16 millimeters thick, it is so much larger than the Glasuta watch that it feels like an entirely different class of product. A watch not for the wrist, but for the bicep, at least for yours truly. Now, I will also add that although the Big Pilot, with the reference 5002, created today's Luftwaffe BR 1940s revival genre, and right there, that is an original A Lange Unzone BR. It's important to remember that the Geo, being both more wearable and just as true to history, has a case to make, as A Lange Unzone was one of the original manufacturers of the BR. Which company today is the original A Lange Unzone? Well, I'm sorry to say, today, A Lange Unzone is known as Glashütte Original, because all of the German brands of Glashütte that were conglomerated into one collectivized watch factory after the war included a Lange und Söhne. So the successor firm to the original Lange that built the BR is in fact these guys. All of which is to say, the Senator Navigator is absolutely legit as a citation of their own real history. Plus, with the caliber 100, you have one of Geo's best ever movements. 55-hour power reserve, chronometer-grade timekeeping, and on the Senator Navigator, there is a flyback mechanism. There's a button on the side of the case that resets the seconds hand to 60. So you set the time, and then you fly back the seconds hand to zero it out, which can also be used as a navigation instrument if you are making your marks in flight, and you need to perpetually reset a chronograph that only displays seconds. You can do that with this particular version of the BR. Note that there are two different versions of the Glashütte. One is a conventional dial, and then the other is the B dial that I just showed you before, with the hours on the inside and the seconds or the minutes on the outside. Now, let's jump into the box right here. We have lots of discussion. We have a comment that the big pilot runs too fast for 2 days, okay for 4 days, and too slow for 2 days. Sort of. Richard Hobring, who was with IWC during the original Caliber 5000 development, has spoken extensively about this, and he posts on the old IWC Collectors Forum under the name Tourbillon. He said basically when they designed the Caliber 5000, they imagined it would be in huge watches that no reasonable person would wear 7 days a week. It would be a weekend watch, so it was designed such that when it was fully wound, it would run really fast. But over the 5 days of the week, when you presumably weren't wearing the watch, it would slow down. So it would gain a lot of time and then lose it, and over 7 days, it would be a very faithful watch. The problem, people put on those 46mm big pilots, and contrary to my opinion, they wore them every single goddamn day. As a result, the watches could run as much as 15 to 20 seconds fast per day if they were kept in a fully animated, fully wound state. All of which is to say, this is a problem that IWC fought for about 15 years, and the 52,000 series versions of that movement finally exercised the demons with the use of twin mainspring barrels. So the twin barrel versions of the big pilot and the Portuguese automatic 7-day, they don't have that problem of running way too fast and then way too slow, but anything built prior, you're probably going to want to let it sit for 3 or 4 days a week just so it doesn't giddy up past the true time, unless you like to be early. That's all on you. Now jumping back into the box right here, Dave Opencar saying, Sinn 856 BR 40mm, 11mm thick, tegmented steel. And then right here, question from Aunt G. Is the Vacheron Constantin 56 worth the money? The basic model, the self-winding, I'd say no. That's a very nicely finished Val-Fleurier movement, but I would want mine to be all Vacheron, which is to say go with the triple calendar, but get it in steel. It's the most charismatic of, I guess they're not last year, the 2018 56 collection. The calendar was the one to get, and in steel, it has a Vacheron movement, Geneva hallmark, a charismatic, well-balanced dial, and a nice link to the era when JLC calendar movements went into Vacheron watches back in the 40s and the 50s. So that would be my choice. I wouldn't buy it in precious metal. I wouldn't buy the base model, but I do take it very seriously and respect it. Crappy Luxury is making a good point. Feel a part of history. Get a Laco. Laco was one of the original constructors. There were a couple, Lange und Söhne, Vempa, IWC, Stoa, Laco, a couple. Not quite as many as the Dirty Dozen, but there were a few vendors, and Laco was one of them. Right there, Scottish Watches in the box, a good friend and a podcast mate. Evening from all at Scottish Watches. Thank you for joining, and thank you for letting me co-host your 100th episode. That was a real pleasure for me. Now, jumping back into our talk on pilots' watches, I have one Omega Speedmaster in here, and it's not the obvious one. I've lamented my failure to buy the X33 when I was in the military. I didn't buy the watch for hundreds of dollars, as I could have under the military purchase program, but all the same, cost no object. The Speedmaster I would buy would be the Speedmaster 1957 50th anniversary from 2007. This was a 1,957-piece limited edition in steel moonwatch case, but anything but on the dial and the movement. Now, what are you getting? Well, you're not getting a hardcore tool watch. You're getting something that's a little bit frivolous and fatuous and fabulous for it. Now, this watch was off the charts cool because you were getting a black enamel dial. Yes, a black Granfo enamel dial with individual series numbering. If that isn't special enough, you are getting a unique caliber 3201 movement. 55-hour reserve, free-sprung, vertical clutch, column wheel, Frederic Piguet based. Coaxial and a chronometer adjusted in 5 positions, and you got a display case back. Speaking of cases, you got a case of cool stuff when you bought this watch. A separate strap, spring bars, a loop, strap tools, literature, all of that. You got the bracelet and the strap. And you got a whole lot more with commemorative packaging unique to this model. All of which is to say that for 50 years of the Speedmaster, this was a fitting tribute. Tons of features. The watch even has 100-meter water resistance, so a standard moonwatch at 50 meters should not be taken swimming. This one is suitable for swimming. This is a 100-meter watch, and that despite the display case back. The enamel dial, the refined high horology movement, all of that so special. And speaking of the enamel dial, you could see it on my wrist. I reviewed this watch about 7 months ago and I fell in love. Look at that vintage Omega logo and marquee with the Speedmaster script up at 12 o'clock. Everything about this timepiece is distinctive of the model. And if you're wondering, yes, they included a sapphire crystal. So special. So distinctive and so singular. This stands apart from the scrum of overproduced Speedmaster limited editions as one of the greatest ever. It's not often you see an enamel dial in a steel case. Now, speaking of pilot's watches, let's say you do want to use your wristwatch for serious pursuits and you want it to be something like a reliable backup instrument. Well, you're going to want the ultimate mechanical pilot's watch, and that is the Sinn EZM-10 Test-Off. Launched in 2011 as the EZM-10, it incorporated every single Sinn technology into one box. In 2014, it became the Test-Off model, which is a collaborative standards for pilot's watches created between Sinn and the University of Aachen. All of which is to say any watch can be submitted for test-off certification, but this one, the EZM-10, is now only available test-off. What else are you getting? What aren't you getting? Every single Sinn technology since the 90s goes into this thing. You're getting a tegmented case in titanium, as hard as ceramic on its outer face, but impossible to fracture or chip. You are getting the AR anti-humidity system. It is filled with nitrogen, and there's a copper sulfate capsule on the side to pull moisture out of the case. You are getting the D3 pushers that can operate underwater. It's also swimmably water resistant for pilot's watch and fully loomed with a captive bezel that is held on by screws, not snapped on with a spring. And the bezel is capped with a sapphire crystal like a Blancpain 50 Fathoms, so the whole bezel looms. And we had a question before about a pilot's watch with a minute's bezel, and that's exactly what you're getting right here. Now keep in mind, this is not a GMT, but all the same, it's an absolute pleasure. It's got everything you would want in a pilot's watch but a GMT. It's got immunity to negative 45 degrees Celsius and plus 80 degrees Celsius. You will be dead before your watch stops working. It has an unlubricated diamond-coated diapol escapement, and the diapol escapement Sinn watches come with a 5-year warranty. Finally, 200 meters water resistant and the option of bracelets or straps. This thing is loaded to the gills, and though 46.5 millimeters in titanium, it wears quite well. I know Ariel Adams is a fan and an owner. I am a fan. I am not yet an owner. I'm going to try to see if it fits my wrist. I'm not settled. It's not an all-the-time watch, but as a weekender, it might be perfect. Finally, what discussion of pilot's watches could be complete without an acknowledgement of Breitling, specifically the Breitling Navitimer, and in this case, the Navitimer Spatiograph, a very quirky countdown timer. Launched in 1997 and made till around 2002-2003, it had a 30-second jumping chronograph display at 9 o'clock. So every 30 seconds it would jump, the idea being that it could be utilized in a landing pattern where you might have to periodically lower to different levels every number of seconds or minutes, and it would make it easier to track small intervals up to 10 minutes. It was ETA based, but the caliber 36 used in this watch was built by Breitling as a module only ever used in this model. So there's an exclusivity there and technical interest you generally don't see on ETA-powered Breitlings. At 41.5 millimeters, we don't have any size issues here. Everyone could wear that watch. And it featured the calculator bezel that's almost mandatory on a Navitimer, so it doesn't undermine the core model. From 2000, these were COSC certified, though before 1999, they would have been tritium dial, so pick whatever your pleasure may be. And there is a funky Roman numeral dial out there. I'm not a fan of the Roman dial, but it exists. If that's your idea of a pilot's watch, by all means, vive la différence, as we say. Finally, I've only seen 2 of these, one in a private collection since I got into the watch business, so they are scarce things. If you find one of these and you have the chance and the inclination, don't sleep on it if you find a good example in good shape with box and papers. And then right here, Edward Ledden. Tim, going off topic with a car question, what do you think of the Shelby Cobra? I'm more of a fan of the original 260 and 289 Cobras than the 427. The 427 to me is cool as a race car. I don't like the look of it on the road. I'm more of a Cobra Daytona guy, too. I like the old Peter Brock Cobra Daytona coupes. To me, those were cooler than the old Shelbys. Very different animal, but more of a racing pedigree. They were never looked at as road cars. So I like Cobras, and I think the vast majority on the road are going to be self-built kits or professionally built kits. So as a fun way to blow $25,000 on an open-air roadster with a big block and a manual transmission, I'm all in favor. But I think there's too much historical hype surrounding the originals, and they're priced accordingly. And then, bump right here, we got Crappy Luxury saying Fortis for pilots' watches. Cheers to that. I'll drink to that. Fortis makes some great ones. And then we got Tippy Cafu asking, Tim, what do you think about the Breitling 806 Revival? We featured a wrist shot of an 806 Revival on the show tonight, and I have a YouTube video of one scheduled to air shortly on Watchbox Reviews. Now, speaking of your preferences, let's talk about your wrist shots. Your pieces on these pixels. Phil showcases a timely Patek Philippe 5711 and Rocos RO139 duality. This duopoly of Genta inspiration includes one watch that costs a lot and another that costs $189. I want to thank Phil for purchasing the dearer of the two from our own Brian Gaufberg here at the Watchbox. Thank you for trusting our company. Charlie Z from Lincoln, England showcases his Omega Diver 300 meter and his new Volkswagen GTI. Congratulations on both the watch and the wheels. I like it. Ben S. stuns with a handsomely composed shot of his own 2019 model year Omega Diver 300 meter white ceramic dial and refreshments. That's probably the best pure photograph of the lot. And then Jim closes our show with an unbeatably timely shot of his Zeg and Sir Lottie limited edition Zenith Type 20 5011K. That was the dealer edition that I believe was made in 5 pieces, I want to say. Probably the most attractive version of that watch. Tim Mosso at thewatchbox.com, guys. If you see a watch on this channel or Watchbox Reviews or my Instagram that you want to buy, purchase and pricing questions at tmosso at thewatchbox.com. I think we've even got a little graphic that pops up, but that's the direct purchase and pricing inquiry line from you to me and my hand-picked crew. And send your wrist shots to tmosso at the Watchbox, or you could send Monday Mailbag at the Watchbox, and I will put your analog on our digital. Thank you so much, guys. Comment, subscribe. Big chat below this one after it airs. I always participate. Thanks to you and my crew for the best job in the world. Time out, Tim out. Good to be back, and thanks for logging on.